Hello, and welcome to the Diaspora Leadership Training. Today's session is about Diaspora Leadership 101, brought to you by Semi Consulting. Semi Consulting focuses on three primary areas: diasporas, development, and leadership. And we do this by looking at what our clients' needs are and providing them research, training, and advisory services. What that looks like specifically is on research, questions around diasporas and migration, immigration, development, humanitarian affairs, and social enterprises are what we most often work on. Our clients range from individuals to organizations and businesses, governments, donor countries, schools and universities, basically anyone who has a vested interest in understanding how to partner with and work more effectively with diaspora networks and in diaspora networks. We also provide training. Here are some of our topics that we've been recently providing in our sessions with the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance, and also other trainings looking at diasporas and development, leadership and advocacy, constituency building, diversity, women's leadership, and nonprofit management and social media. Lastly, we also provide advisory services, which is much more customized, I think, to different needs that clients have come to us with. A lot of it centers around project development, public outreach, strengthening public and private partnerships, developing strategic communications, and lastly, individual coaching, an area that has really come to us from many diaspora individuals, as well as organizations that want to have a strategy around how to engage with diaspora networks. So that's a little bit about what we do and where we're from. For those of you who are also familiar with my work, I'm also the founder of the Diaspora African Women's Network, or DAWN as it's called, and it's in these various capacities that I've been lucky enough to really look at the question around diasporas and development. So today's conversation is really about an introduction to diasporas and leadership, also leading up to the term diaspora leadership, which we've embraced so strongly here at Semi. And lastly, looking ahead at what the horizon shows for different types of diaspora leadership opportunities, some challenges, but also ways that we expect this space to grow. Now, in this brief conversation, we're going to discuss a bit about diasporas and migration and why it matters, but we're also going to explore some of the fundamental elements for diaspora leadership. Lastly, we'll look at some of the current challenges as well as opportunities. And hopefully within these sort of three buckets, you can find areas of interest to you that you can hopefully continue the conversation at another time. So what is the diaspora? What does it mean? Why is this word being used by so many groups, so many people? Why is it all over the internet? This is sort of the hot word of the day. Well, I really like this picture here. I've got a picture of people moving back and forth around the world, different shades, different colors, and you can see that this is really the human story, the experience of migrating, of the journey of one's life, the journey of a community, and the journey of how a country ultimately extends beyond its borders with its people. Now, the diaspora, the term itself can be a bit difficult. It's very, very difficult to fit it in this whole huge mix of terms. We often think of diasporas as synonymous, let's say, with refugees or migrants or immigrants. Diasporas might mean that you're a descendant. It might mean that you're someone who's seeking asylum in another country. Well, these are all sort of relevant to the diaspora space, but truthfully, diaspora is a term that is much more of an umbrella that encompasses these experiences as well as many others. As we like to think of it, diaspora experience is really about a consciousness and a commitment, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. Now, specifically, as we look at the definition of diasporas, there are many different definitions out there, but this one speaks the most to us from the International Organization for Migration. I think it's blocked from the logo, but it's from 2013, a conference that was held with diaspora ministers from around the world. Now, essentially, it's got multiple parts. Immigrants and their descendants who live outside of their country or of birth or ancestry, either temporarily or permanently, but they still maintain ties to their country of origin. Now, it's tough to say countries of origin if you yourself were born in one country, lived there your whole life, and understand yourself to be of that origin. The diaspora experience is interesting because origin also relates to your ancestry, your narratives, your legacy, hearkening back 1, 2, 3, multiple generations, really. And so this is also used synonymously with countries of heritage, and the country of residence is where many people identify themselves with. Out of this entire definition, the most important part is the diaspora's ability and desire to maintain effective and material ties. This is the consciousness and commitment that we're going to look at in a bit that really shapes and defines the diaspora experience. It's not enough to be living outside of your country. It's not enough to have a descendancy to a certain country. It's really about how you are developing, strengthening, and maintaining material ties to those countries. Now, for many, this is sending letters back and forth to family or emails, I guess today it would be. It's also including remittances, money that you send home. But material ties also means so much more. It includes vacations and visits to the country, cultural heritage tours, volunteer trips, the ways in which we're able to keep connected to countries of origin really run the gamut, and it's exciting to see new ways that diasporas are able to maintain these ties. Now, when we think of diasporas, right now it's really been encapsulated by certain regional groups. In particular, my work on the African diaspora space all of these years, many of us still use the terms as if it's unique to the African diaspora. But we shouldn't forget how universal the diaspora experience really is. You can look back into ancient times and recall movements of the Jewish people, of Armenians, of even Africans, early pre-slavery days into the era of when migration was really much more across countries and throughout regions. And then in the 19th and early 20th century, where we see many more Western diaspora narratives emerge, the Irish, the Polish, the Italian. We also see a significant movement of the Palestinian diaspora. And also, let's not forget the movement of the Japanese in East Asia, as well as other Asian populations. Now, more recently, perhaps in the last 50 years, 60 years of the 20th century, the Caribbean levels of migration have also skyrocketed, along with India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and with the emergence of independent countries, post-colonial independent African countries, we also see a huge surge in African populations growing around the world. Now, when we talk about diasporas, it's a question that many ask, why are we talking about diasporas? Why does it matter? Well, here are some reasons. Now, number one, we know what's powerful about any diaspora group is that they're transnational, and therefore they're connected across nations, across countries, across oceans, in touch with their people, if you will, all over the world. It shows that they're powerfully networked and that they are committed to staying connected to their countries. And these commitments are actually viewed as deep investments. Diasporas are also active in their local communities, where they live, where they reside. They're active in keeping connected to community activities, cultural activities, heritage, social spaces. And part of that is because they want to also remain close to developments. And diasporas become critical bridges and interlocutors between the countries they reside in and the countries they originate from. And it's in this way that they become cultural ambassadors, if you will. They're representatives of not necessarily the politics back home, but of the multidimensional richness that every country has to offer. And in many cases, people that are once removed from their country take it upon themselves to become the sort of overall representative, if you will. I myself am of a diaspora community, and I'm very proud to share and share my experience with Eritrea, country of my family's origin. But as a first generation, my parents' narrative when they arrived to the States is different than the narrative that I've developed, because my second generation experience puts me in a different viewpoint. So there's issues about how diasporas are able to transfer this ambassadorship, if you will, across generations, how they're able to pass down narratives to the next generation of representatives. And lastly, it also helps them gain the skills of being adaptable to different environments by virtue of knowing how to work between these multiple spaces. Even as it gets handed down to the children and to the children's children, this ability to stand within, between, and across two countries or more is profound. Lastly, it's also deeply profound because with that sort of knowledge, ability, and skill sets, there's also a significant availability of wealth, capital, and resources that can be transferred between the two. Now, wealth isn't necessarily limited to the financial wealth, as you probably think. Wealth also implies social, political, human wealth, the agency of each community and their ability to engage with other partners, with governments, with the international community. These are skill sets that ultimately are transferable and of value to the countries of origin and the countries of residence, but also the communities, I think, in all these settings, stand to gain the most from diaspora skill sets and capital. Now, it's not easy to paint the picture entirely rosy, and that wouldn't be fair and it wouldn't be true. There are obvious challenges with being in the diaspora, and this is something many more people are familiar with because of the inherent challenges of being a transnational community. First, just like the image showed, this is a dispersed network. Experiences in Australia will vary differently than an experience in the United States. The experience of diaspora communities in Europe depends so much on the conditions and the environment in Europe that a community in another country, a continent rather, may not be able to appreciate it without being there. This also leads to difficult navigation between the agendas and interests of diaspora groups. Diasporas are not monolithic. And because they're not monolithic, even within diaspora communities, there is the challenge of differentiating whether there is shared agendas and interests or whether there are whether their agendas and interests actually diverge. This could also lead to fragmentation and challenges with building a unified or at least aligned set of partnerships within diasporas and across diasporas. Diasporas are also often resource strapped, and not because of any indication of economic poverty or challenge, but rather, as pointed in the previous slide, diasporas are always looking at how to transfer their wealth to the countries of origin, between the countries of residence and the countries of origin. This means that whatever wealth is available to them, chances are it's going towards an initiative or an objective, and it isn't necessarily institutionalized in the way that many of us think of. Diasporas are also difficult because of the stereotypes, the obvious stereotypes that often lead to politicization and extremist views of political sentiments, but also assumptions made of different diaspora actors, agendas, and interests. A growing challenge as of late is realizing engagement also matters, and there tends to be a limited host country engagement with diaspora communities. Fortunately, this is changing. More and more countries that are receiving and home to new communities and diaspora spaces are becoming more invested in partnering and learning and listening to diaspora networks. You can point to many examples, and we'll look at that in a bit. Lastly, some of the other challenges with diasporas is that conflict-affected diasporas, or communities that have fled conflict, fled war, fled insecurity, and let's remember the term fled is voluntary and involuntary. Leaving a home country by choice because of insecure circumstances does mean that you've left, that you've fled, but it also means that you've left under circumstances that are conflict related, conflict affected. And those groups in particular, their experience in the host country, their terms of arrival and whatnot, also make them prone, vulnerable to politicization by each other and by others. The last point I want to make about some of the challenges is an increasing tendency to partner with diaspora organizations and actors for a poverty alleviation agenda or a development agenda, which makes sense, right? Because diasporas are also invested, want to make investments and inroads in long-term development. I don't know wherever you're from, but as a member of a diaspora, chances are you would love to have the opportunity to live in your country of origin if you could, if the development circumstances allowed for it, and if there was economic opportunity in the way that there is in your host country. Again, these terms are always tricky: home country, host country, country of origin. You know, I'm a New Yorker. I born in New York, lived all over the United States, traveled for work and school in many countries, and I've always identified myself as an Eritrean and as an American. So when I tell you that I'm an Eritrean American, it really does capture that sort of bicultural, binational upbringing that more and more individuals around the world are having. Now, that doesn't mean that diasporas will be limited to a development agenda. It actually means that that is the starting base where many diasporas want to begin. But there's an overwhelming focus on that first step of addressing poverty and development, and yet failing to go further and looking at how diasporas can be institutionalized and withstand the multiple cycles of every type of work on poverty alleviation, development. There's also civic leadership, and there's business development, and there's advocacy and philanthropy, areas that together strengthen the original agenda to fight poverty and promote development. So with the diasporas, we also have to remember that so much of the diaspora experience is about the whole person's journey. Every person has a different story: how they came, why they came, where they were born, why they identify as a certain national country, certain nationality rather. And it's this diagram that I think really captures where the diaspora journey really begins. So what I want to do now is go over this diagram a bit, and we're going to spend a chunk of our time on understanding how these are all connected to each other. And therein, you'll begin to understand how it is that diasporas are taking steps to lead and why they are shaped towards agendas that serve the needs of their country of origin as well as the needs of their country of residence. In many cases, especially on the African continent, there are more and more regional efforts and pan-continental efforts for diasporas. So this is becoming less and less about a country-to-country experience. It's more about the consciousness and commitment that diasporas are carving out for themselves. Okay? So let's start with the first segment of this cycle, the terms of departure, migration, and arrival. I can't stress to you how important this is in how diaspora experiences are shaped. Whether it's an individual or a community as a whole, it's important to always first think about when that person or that group actually departed from their country. What were the terms of their departure? Did they leave voluntarily? Was it for school? Was it for work? Or was it circumstances that left them with literally no other option but to leave? Were they fleeing insecurity? Were they away because of tragedy or survival? And in those terms of departure, think about how the psychology is shaped of an individual. A young woman who gets a scholarship to go to school in the United States has a completely different terms of departure than a man or a woman who's fleeing a war and is leaving from a displacement camp, applying as a refugee. Even more extreme, the saddest is where we have individuals who have to file for asylum in their own home country, needing to find protection abroad for fear of persecution. These are many different ways that people emigrate from their home countries. And this is what is revealed in the course of the diaspora experience, of how that narrative is shaped. Now, along with that, it's also important to look at the terms of the migration itself, the journey. Did that person leave on a plane, or did they have to go on foot? Did they have assistance and support for the costs and the circumstances that they were bound to sure to face? Was this someone presenting a passport at an airport and getting into a business class seat? Now, that we often think of as an expatriate experience, where someone is leaving because of an employment opportunity and costs of living are subsidized. There is assistance for costs of living. This is a completely different diaspora experience than the person who has to leave with a laissez-passer, a one-way ticket out, or a person who has gotten refugee protection in a certain country and they have limited resources during their journey. Even more harrowingly, what's all over the screens on the TV is Migrant Crisis that is being at an all-time high in Europe, stemming from Africa, Syria, Eastern Europe. People are just taking their life's every risk to get to Europe. And that term of migration, on those boats where we're hearing horrific stories every day, that shapes the person's health and well-being and psychology, and also it shapes their placement in the country that they arrive in. And that's where we move to the terms of arrival. How you arrived to your destination or to your country of origin also really shapes your experience, because it really defines the type of agency or the level of agency you can have. Now, this isn't static. Someone who comes with very difficult, limited circumstances can actually turn their experience into a much more powerful time. And the terms of their arrival depend on a number of things that are unpredictable at best. But the difference between someone arriving with assistance from an NGO and helping them in a city they have no personal connections to. Think of how many towns in the United States are receiving refugees and helping them in their integration into the United States. That's a very different term of arrival than someone who arrives with family members who are able to pick them up at the airport and help them find a job and teach them the ins and outs of their new country. These terms of departure, migration, and arrival have a profound shape, a profound impact on the diaspora narrative. And what was true for an individual, a community, or a country 30 years ago could drastically change because of facts on the ground. Countries that are remembering a narrative of a certain time, and individuals, rather, that are also sharing that narrative, are sharing a narrative that is true for them. But there's the reality that things change, and people's departure, migration, and arrival changes. There are many stories of different ways that people left their countries and came, and it's important that we are mindful and include all of those stories. There is no one diaspora experience. Now, the area where we do share a multiple set of connections and similarities in the diaspora experience is with how we maintain ties to our heritage countries. This is really the exciting part of diaspora leadership, is exploring these ties. You remember in the IOM definition of the diasporas, it is about how they maintain effective and material ties to their country of origin. This is where the creativity and innovation begin. This is where culture is preserved. This is where it becomes multi-generational, where a small community can extend itself around the world. I'm thinking of the Armenian diaspora example as a very powerful network, still fairly smaller than other diasporas, but incredibly influential, organized, and diverse in how that diaspora community maintains ties from their different countries of residence. The last two are really much more personal and psychological. In assessing diaspora experiences and networks and initiatives, it's important to understand where that actor's desire to remain connected lies and where their desire to even return lies. Oftentimes, diaspora networks are operating for the sake of preservation and promotion, but there's oftentimes another truth that is very difficult to admit, that there's also a desire to return. And if you're lucky enough, there are plans to return. Now, being honest and open about these aspects of the diaspora experience really place diaspora partnerships in a much stronger position. Whether you're of the diaspora or you're not, these are the spaces that you must assess. So again, we're going to look at ties to heritage country, and we need to remember that this last segment is such a personal, I think, journey for many, that sometimes the answer changes over time. Sometimes it's an admission that isn't easy to make, but it does ultimately have an impact on the type of experience you have as a diaspora. Now, looking at the diaspora experience as we've gone over it, and looking at leadership, it actually comes together quite nicely for examining what diaspora leadership means. Now, a lot of times when we think of diaspora leadership, it falls into various sectors and issues. These are just some of the most popular when we've asked in previous sessions around feedback with different clients. What type of diaspora leadership are you looking for, and how do you want to participate and engage? And oftentimes it's around development. It's looking at the question of remittances and women's issues, humanitarian, education initiatives. It runs the range. I'm really always impressed by the diversity of commitment that diasporas have to their countries of origin and to these causes. One that isn't here that really should be here, I think, an emerging space is technology, impact investing, and social media. Tech is there, actually, I take that back. But social media and impact investing has really emerged as a new space of diasporas over the last year or two. Okay? Now, diaspora leadership also takes on many forms. These are just some of the common examples for nonprofit, for-profit, and grassroots spaces. These are some of the ways that diasporas have forged their ties with their country of origin and the country of residence. Think about it. You could live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I'm from, and you could run a really powerful museum that preserves your culture, and it seeks to represent your country of origin's culture. We have that example actually in Minneapolis with the first ever Somali Museum of Cultural Art. It's the first museum in the United States, at least, that is all about preservation of Somali culture, and it was founded by a Somali diaspora individual. But you can see how many different ways we're leveraging our resources and using our time, talent, and treasure to offer an initiative that focuses on future outcomes, builds trust, and benefits the greater good. Some of these, I'm sure, also are more familiar for you, where many of us get started as members of the diaspora and community-based associations. That grassroots space is where many of us, I think, begin and where we exist. Okay? Now, with any of these diaspora entities that we just looked at, all of them have these factors. All of them rely on these crucial organizational elements. Starting from the bottom, the widest base of this triangle, the most important parts for a sustainable diaspora initiative is that there's significant investment and that it's multi-generational with multiple narratives that aims to preserve culture and history in some way or another. And that also has representation, the widest representation of diaspora experiences. I apologize for the text. It looks like this platform has changed the sizing a bit. So the last triangle, the lower right hand, says representation. When you look at how diasporas are making investments. This is, again, beyond financial capital, but it is about the social, human, and economic capital that diasporas possess. And a successful diaspora leadership initiative will actually look at itself becoming multi-generational. Multi-generational initiatives have to start from day one. It isn't the kind of thing that can just happen magically because you have a second generation in existence. That buy-in and that participation has to begin at the same time. And that's a lesson I've learned quite a bit through different diaspora projects and work that I've done in the past, that the most successful diaspora initiatives are the ones that include and look to strengthen their work across generations. The hardest part about diaspora leadership is recognizing the importance of narratives, and that word is plural for a reason. Diasporas, again, are not monolithic. So even in your respective diaspora community, you will discover that there are many different voices within that diaspora, not just on politics, but across gender and age, across areas of interest, across professional expertise. There are many different voices within each of our diaspora networks, and it's crucial that that is also incorporated from the beginning. You can have a narrow mission, right? A very specific goal, a very specific change goal. But again, back to that point of inclusivity and being inviting. It's about recognizing from the outset the multiplicity of narratives. The last two are more self-explanatory, with preservation of culture and history, and also representation, ensuring that this is representative of diaspora interests, right? That cannot go overlooked. The second level of this triangle is really where I think a lot of us pay attention to the work that we're doing in terms of leadership. We look at our leadership from a place of service, community work, volunteering, or using your time, talent, and treasure for a good cause. We also look at our diaspora leadership work as providing assistance, providing support. Assistance meaning direct assistance to a group in need, or direct assistance to the country of origins, development inside the country. Or we view our roles in diaspora leadership in advocacy. And I'm using this word advocacy just given my background in public service, but advocacy is about voice, and voice through media, voice through grassroots organizing, voice through establishing an organization that seeks to change policy. And many times these are primarily the buckets we fall into. It's going to be a service that you're doing, or you're providing assistance to a specific group, or you are providing advocacy support. I really struggle with the word voice. I will never say giving voice to the voiceless, because that's not true. Everybody has a voice. It's about learning how to use the voice, and especially in spaces where you're not being listened to, you're not being heard. If anything, this idea of giving voice to the voiceless is actually a reflection of how many people are not listening, and making the audience listen to you. That to me is really where the conversation should be. So whether you're launching a business, or you're launching a social change initiative, or you want to begin doing more acts of service, these are really important aspects to consider. At the top, I think, is where we all are, where everyone shares the same goal and value, and that's creating community. Diaspora leadership is ultimately about what kind of community you're creating, and whether that's sustainable and inviting, whether that's actually lifting the community up, right? Because that's what prompts so many people in any spectrum, not just diasporas, but you want to do good for your community, you want to do good for your people, you want to do good for your country. And that ultimately rests on your focus on strengthening the community. These are the main elements that must exist for diaspora leadership initiatives, regardless of your venture, regardless of your idea. If it doesn't have vision, if it doesn't exists from a place of service, servant leadership. And if it doesn't have solutions, any type of leadership initiative would suffer. But on top of it, for diaspora leadership, you must also have these organizational elements. Okay? Now, looking ahead and in conclusion, I want us to think about, what does diaspora leadership mean for now, for tomorrow, for the next 50 years? We're in a really exciting time. Diaspora leadership takes on many forms, and this is what we do quite a bit of training on, around looking at the ins and outs of diaspora leadership in the 21st century, the various ways that diasporas are beginning to harness their capital and their skill sets. We're going to look at diasporas and development, looking at not just the role of remittances, but how diasporas are really stakeholders in the advancement of development in their countries that they live in and countries that they originate from. We know that diasporas are also important in humanitarian affairs in response to disasters. We know that Haiti, Somalia, and Philippines, just in the last 5 years, 3 very, very well-documented communities of critical diaspora relief that has helped in very many ways, helped the countries. And more importantly, help the people, I think, survive. Increasingly now, there's a lot more focus on the role of diasporas in social media, a space that I am very active in on my personal Twitter handle, but also what diaspora constituencies and agendas are all about. There's also a growing movement of examining diaspora volunteerism and knowledge capital, both from governments and countries that want to remain connected with the populations outside their borders, and trying to find ways to attract them back by the transfer of knowledge, the transfer of their skills, attracting them to be tied to their countries through volunteering, through cultural tours, through a number of ways. But diaspora leadership is really I'd say it's a two-way experience, but I'm inclined to say it's actually a universal experience again. This is more than an exchange between the individual and the country they live in, or the individual and the country they left. This is really about that consciousness and commitment, and how it's showing itself through structured initiatives like nonprofits and for-profits, through advocacy campaigns, through conversations happening online, through the sending of relief and remittances to help families cover the basic costs of living in other countries. Diaspora leadership is on so many levels an exciting space to watch. It's an exciting space to invest in, and we're looking at this much more closely. We know that such leadership requires a lot more investment in skills and capacity building, requires a lot more investment in measuring diaspora's impact and capturing that philanthropy. That time, talent, and treasure that we're so good at doing needs to actually be captured on paper, captured in the remittances that are being sent back home. How many of them are actually declared when we file taxes in our respective countries as donations? How many of us have proof of all the giving that we do? And how many diaspora communities are institutionalizing their capital and their wealth? You know, there's great examples underway with the Turkish Philanthropy Fund, the Center for Arab American Philanthropy, really prominent institutions that are capturing ways that these diaspora communities are making investments for themselves and for their countries of origin. Lastly, I think a major area of importance for diaspora leadership is investing in effective communications and advocacy. And this is my area of specialty. I really enjoy this space a lot, having come from working in U.S. government. I've actually worked for 3 presidents, and I've managed to be a part of massive grassroots campaigning. And I've also really just come to appreciate the power of the voice, and how that voice is to be leveraged for your asks, for your agenda, for your long-term goals of benefiting the greater good. That leveraging your voice and influencing others, that's the advocacy I'm talking about. It's critical that diasporas make investments in this area as well. Now, looking ahead, we'd be happy to talk more with you about different ways that you can invest in diaspora leadership. Again, the work that we do is research, training, and advocacy. Training is primarily for diasporas, but increasingly it's been opened up now to institutions who want to learn about diasporas, to institutions who also want to learn about their own leadership opportunities with new communities. In the United States, I work quite a bit with new American communities who are just shy of maybe referring to themselves as diasporas, because truthfully they've integrated and become quite active as hyphenated Americans, if you will. This enjoyment of multicultural society is of interest to all of us, and it's of value to all of us. And of course, the research and analysis that we've done in the past with projects in Bangladesh, projects on Nigeria, looking at these communities, looking at many communities actually around who are they, where are they based, what kind of relationship do they have with their country of origin, just some of what we do. But I encourage you to contact us. There's our mailing address, but just visit our website at semiconsulting.com. You can email me at samhar@semiconsulting.com or find us on Twitter. Both the company and I are quite active, and I really look forward to hearing from you. If you enjoyed this training, please let us know. If you have feedback, comments, or suggestions, please let us know. And if you happen to be on Twitter, we do like that hashtag, hashtag DLT 2015. That's for the Diaspora Leadership Training 2015. Thank you again, everybody. I hope you've had an enjoyable session. I hope this helped you learn more about the Diaspora Experience and diaspora leadership. And I thank the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance for partnering with us and making this such an enjoyable conversation. Thank you.